evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, I have three small things to talk to you about. So the first of these items has been coming for a very long time, even though I've been hesitant to talk about it in the past. Time for me to finally sell myself out. I have set up an official Patreon for this channel, which you can find down below. As I move towards dealing with more serious topics on this channel, I find that I'm starting to hit a wall with the information that I can find. When it comes to investigating companies, you get to a point where you're going to have to actually pay to pull records, and I just don't have that kind of money at the moment. Now, I don't like asking for money, but the way I look at it, I'm a YouTube partner anyway, and I have been since I started, so everyone's been paying me through video ads whether they wanted to or not. So from this video forward, none of my videos are going to be monetized because it's a win-win situation. People who want to donate to me can, and everybody who doesn't want to doesn't have to sit through all of these lovely YouTube ads we all like so much. So that's all I'm going to say about that. The second thing is that I'm going to be doing my damnedest to get content out to people more regularly. This has been an issue since I began this channel. My motivation for making videos is always somewhat of a roller coaster, but I will nevertheless be doing my best to keep a somewhat regular schedule from this point forward. I'm currently in the process of looking for work anyway, and so taking 20 hours out of my week to make a video isn't really taxing me that much at the moment. Oh, and one final thing, I quit Twitter for the last time recently because once the terms of service stop being a politically neutral set of standards and start to become molded by a panel of very carefully selected far left-wing activist groups with a view to putting paid to anyone with political viewpoints to the right of Stalin, then I have no interest in participating in a medium that is designed to function as an echo chamber for the fortitudinally challenged. And that's all there is to it. Bon voyage. So now finally let's get to the topic of this video, something I really didn't think I would ever cover in a million years, but it's sort of like the painting of Dorian Gray. The more I've looked into this, the worse it gets. I'm of course talking about a recent crowdfunding venture that has taken the retro video game community by storm, the Coleco Chameleon. At this point, of course, I'm really starting to feel like the crowdfunding police given the previous projects I've investigated, so here's another one to add to the list of stuff I've covered. And might I add, buckle up, this is going to be one hell of a ride. So the roots of the story go back several months to a different crowdfunding campaign, the campaign for the quote-unquote retro video game system. And so we need to start there first. Oh, and one caveat before we begin, I'm not any sort of electrical engineer, and so I'll be relying heavily on the opinions of people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of those topics throughout this presentation. I'm just mainly here to review the evidence and ask basic common sense questions. So, the retro VGS, what was it and how did all of this begin? Well, it's a very long story, so I'll just give you the cliff notes to save time. The retro video game system was a proposed video game console which would essentially quote-unquote bring back cartridge-based gaming. It was designed to essentially be an all-in-one retro gaming machine capable of cloning a wide array of old 16 and 8-bit consoles. The technology that was supposed to power the system was supposed to be a field programmable gate array circuit, which is a type of electronic chip that can be computer programmed to become any sort of circuit the designer wishes, and this is the type of technology that has been used for cloning numerous video game consoles in the past, which is something I'll get into later. So in theory, the system was supposed to be able to switch between retro consoles whenever you put in a cartridge that belonged to that console. Put in an NES cartridge and it would become an NES and you could play your games. That was the original concept. However, in addition to playing these old systems, the unique feature of the console was supposed to be the ability for indie developers to develop original titles for it, as well as giving them the ability to port their existing little indie games over. The Retro VGS team also purchased the tooling so that they could produce plastic shells of a very old console, the Atari Jaguar, which would in turn house their new console. The project attracted a lot of criticism early on, mainly because of perceived obsolescence of making games on cartridges and the lack of internet access. However, it was clear that they were just making a product that was designed for the retro gaming community, and so far, so innocuous. Now this takes us up to August 2015, when they announced that the price of their proposed console, which had been somewhere around the $150 mark, was going to be doubled to $300 or so. This upset a lot of people. However, the problems didn't really start until they announced that they were going to be switching their crowdfunding project from Kickstarter over to Indiegogo 2 days before the project was due to launch. Now, the reasoning behind this change is actually quite simple. The Kickstarter rules strictly prohibit photorealistic 3D renderings of a product, which they had plenty of, and those are also featured quite prominently on the Indiegogo campaign that they went ahead with. The rules also require people manufacturing something like this to show their backers a working prototype instead of the photorealistic 3D renderings, and it was at this point that it became clear that they didn't actually have a working prototype, and that's the reason why they switched. So, in the midst of all this controversy, probably in an attempt to allay the fears of potential backers, on or about the 27th of September 2015, John Carlson, the supposed engineer for the project, released a now deleted video in which he supposedly demonstrated a quote-unquote stripped down version of a prototype for the console. This prototype is now widely considered a fake, and given what I'm going to discuss later, it is almost certainly a fake. There are way too many problems with the video to go into it in depth, but here are a few key ones. There's no cartridge in the system, and there were no controllers plugged in either. It was just a simple plastic shell with some or other board inside. What was shown of the interface was what looks like Windows or some other desktop operating system, and was operated with a mouse and keyboard, even though the mouse wire looks like it's going nowhere near the quote-unquote console. Needless to say, this video didn't actually make the backers worry any less about the state of the project. In their end, the Indiegogo campaign closed with only $80,000, which is 4% of their goal, and as it was fixed funding, they didn't even get that money. All in all, the project failed as so many do, and if the story ended there, then it honestly wouldn't be worth telling. But anyway, this brings us all the way back around to the rebirth of the console, from being the retro video game system to being the Coleco Chameleon. So the first thing to mention is who Coleco are. Coleco are a video game console company that produced the ColecoVision home console in the 80s. However, since 2005, the company has been owned by a Chicago company, River West Brands, and as such, the Coleco of today has almost no bearing on the original company, and so the Coleco Chameleon is basically the exact same product by the exact same people, only now sporting the Coleco logo. It is Coleco in name only. Anyway, in December, one of the three-person team behind the retro VGS, Mike Kennedy, made a statement on the Atari Age forums, which are forums that will be central to what I'm about to discuss in a bit. In this statement, Mike discusses the relaunch and announces that the Chameleon would be revealed in early 2016, and so now this takes us to the big reveal. The project was supposed to debut its working prototype at the New York Toy Fair, which was held on February the 13th to the 16th, 2016, and the Chameleon had pride of place in the Coleco booth at the fair, which is a sort of trade show for the toy industry, where they showed off what they claimed to be a working FPGA clone of a SNES console. Unfortunately enough, it was at this event where it all went pear-shaped for them yet again. Now, linked down below is a gallery of photo evidence gathered by the aforementioned Atari Age forums, which all points to a very troubling conclusion, that this wasn't a working prototype of the console at all, but rather simply a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, in particular a SNES Junior, hidden under an Atari Jaguar shell, and also that all of the games that they were running were being loaded off a SNES cartridge that allows you to load SNES ROMs off a SD card instead of the prototype cartridge that they were claiming to show. So let us review all of this evidence, shall we, and take things one point at a time. So the first point is quite small and simple. The console appears to be running standard composite connectors because there are 3 wires coming out of the back, but according to a post on their Facebook, the console is supposed to be HDMI only, with analog support being optional if they manage to sort out certain hardware issues. What they are saying and what they were showing are 2 completely different things. The second point is the entire back of the unit itself. The first issue with it is that the unit is using a proprietary Nintendo video output, as you can see from the unique oblong shaped video connector. And the second issue is the power cable dangling off the unit here. This is being conclusively identified as a 3-in-1 power supply for the SNES, Genesis and NES consoles. And so the thing is definitely using SNES power because you can see the unused connector dangling off the back. This brings us to the third issue, the layout of the ports. On a standard Super Nintendo, there's a third port between the composite out and the power, but on a SNES Junior, they are spaced close together. All you have to do is do a simple comparison of the spacing of the ports on the back of the SNES to the back of the quote-unquote Chameleon, and you can see something quite troubling. The spacing is precisely the same. But it gets even better. The third point is the cartridge slot. All you have to do is compare it to the SNES cartridge slot to see that it's the exact same color and built the exact same way. But a user at the Atari Age forum went even further and got a SNES Junior board and an Atari Jaguar shell and built a mock-up of the quote-unquote prototype as described by the forum. And wouldn't you know it, the cartridge slot fits the exact same on both machines, and those 2 machines look practically identical. But of course we're not done. There's also the matter of their prototype cart, a cartridge which they have designed themselves and brought to the fair to show what their cartridges will look like. Well, someone in the Atari Age forums noted that the cart has a very distinctive notch on top of it, which seems to match the one on the SD to SNES, which is a popular ROM cartridge for the SNES. This theory is further compounded by the fact that one of their partners, Pico Interactive, sent someone over to test a SNES compatible cartridge on the prototype, which worked just fine, except for the fact that they had some technical issues with the Chameleon itself, and so the Chameleon had to be reset, and when it was reset it came up with a strange menu system that perhaps looked a little something like this. He then questioned Mike Kennedy, who was nearby, about the system, upon which Mike told him that it was a super special cartridge cooked up by the Coleco Chameleon engineers and that it had a SD card inside of it. After a few more retries, the guy from Pico eventually noticed a copyright on the menu system, and then he figured out that it was a stock SD to SNES cart, as everybody have said. He also provides some additional details that reinforce some other points about the console as well, but you can read those down below for yourselves and make your own mind up as to what he's saying. Though it's worth noting for later that the excuse used as to why he couldn't look inside the console was that they were scared he was going to break something and they couldn't fix it at the event. So now we get to the final point. Someone in the Atari Age forums noted a weird detail in one of the videos, namely the claim that the controllers, which are cheap third-party SNES controllers, are hardwired into the board. Why they were using these SNES controllers instead of their own proprietary USB controllers on their own prototype board is a total mystery, perhaps because SNES doesn't take USB. Anyway, if one looks carefully, you'll note that the dimensions of the dogbone controllers simply can't fit through the holes they've drilled in the perspex. This is of course a matter of spatial judgment, but you can measure this for yourselves in any paint program with the ruler. According to my measurements, the holes are only 73 pixels wide, while the controllers themselves are about 86 pixels wide. This suggests that the controllers are simply plugged into whatever board is inside the console, but then why lie about hard wiring SNES controllers? Also, if the controllers were hardwired, it would mean that they were permanently stuck to the console because they simply couldn't get out of those perspex holes. What makes this even more perplexing is that there's actually a shot in the video with the controllers outside of the perspex case. How would they be able to get the controllers out of the holes in the perspex case later on in the demonstration if them being hardwired wasn't simply a lie? This, coupled with the fact that they have their own proprietary USB controller, suggests that they were using SNES controllers plugged into SNES ports on the inside. So let me summarize this for a second. What we're dealing with here runs on SNES power. It uses SNES video out, which is a very specific type of video out socket. It has the exact same spacing between ports as the SNES Junior, has the exact same cartridge slot in the exact same place on the board, uses a flash card designed for the SNES, and most probably connects directly to third-party SNES controllers, but we're supposed to believe that this is not really simply a SNES in a box, and instead that this is a super advanced FPGA prototype. Needless to say that a lot of people weren't convinced, especially since all they have to do to sink everybody's battleship on this accusation is just open up their console and show everybody that there's something other than a SNES in there. Anyway, there we go. Pretty compelling evidence that the first quote-unquote prototype of the Coleco Chameleon, like the first prototype of the console that came before it, was essentially a fake. Now, presenting a fake prototype before you're about to embark on a kickstarting adventure is pretty low. But of course it didn't end there. The Kickstarter campaign was due to begin not long after the toy fair. However, in an event no way connected with the previous revelations about their prototype, on February the 27th, 2016, they announced via their Facebook page that they were going to suspend their Kickstarter launch indefinitely to make the console even better. This was ostensibly to take advantage of all the connections and interest that they had garnered from commercial partners at the event. The problem came, though, in the images that they included with the post, perhaps in an attempt to silence their critics, of the Chameleon board in a clear shell showing the circuit board. The problem, though, was that this failed to satisfy the investigators over at the Atari Age forums. Kevtris, who is their in-house FPGA expert, was quick to confirm that the board contained no visible signs of any FPGA chips or any related components. The only question was, though, what the hell was it? Well, after days of looking, the forum finally hit upon the answer. The board in the photograph was none other than a standard, cheap video capture card that you slot into a PC and use to monitor surveillance cameras. If you just take a look at the two circuits, the resemblance is undeniable. Everything is in the exact same place, so once again they were trying to pass off a fake as a genuine working prototype. And they were doing this just before they went back into launching a campaign to get everybody's money. Now, of course, this picture lasted all of 14 minutes on the page before being yanked from their profile, but by then it was too late. Their attempt to silence their detractors had not just failed, but it backfired spectacularly, causing an even bigger PR disaster. But of course, once again, it gets worse. To finish up, we have a series of allegations by the guy who is set to film the Coleco Chameleon's Kickstarter pitch, Brian Thomas Barnard. Barnard's accusations, which he made via his YouTube channel, and bear in mind they are accusations at this stage, though given the history here I don't think we have much reason to doubt him, are that they failed to produce a prototype for him to shoot the pitch video before the toy fair, and then after the toy fair and all of the revelations about the prototype there, they decided to change what he was supposed to shoot. So the original idea that he was told before the toy fair was that he was going to have a prototype to shoot a commercial for the Chameleon. Essentially it was going to be a stereotypical family console ad where happy families sit around enjoying the console, all the typical stuff you'll find in these kind of console ads. Only the Chameleon team failed to deliver the prototype that he needed for filming before the toy fair, and the excuse that he got is that they were scared that the kids might break the prototype. So the next time they wanted him to help shoot the Kickstarter video was after the toy fair, but this time they scrapped the happy families idea. They didn't provide a prototype and they simply wanted him to change the entire video that he was going to shoot. His new role was simply to shoot/record voiceovers and then Mike Kennedy's call to action, which Brian Thomas Barnard flat out refused to do. Why? Because he felt that his voiceovers and video segments could then be manipulatively edited over any video or any picture, and as far as he was concerned, this was highly unethical, and he didn't want to be part of scamming people. He has since moved to distance himself from the project, releasing a full script of the proposed pitch video that he was going to shoot, and you can find his video and all the other information in the video description. So basically, at the end of the day, we have a mountain of evidence on 2 to 3 fake prototypes and failure to deliver several other times, with the common thread running through all of it being simply failure to deliver a working prototype of the Coleco Chameleon / Retro VGS over and over again. But just because they faked these prototypes, or the evidence is pretty strong that they faked these prototypes, doesn't prove 100% that they don't have a working SNES core. I mean, they could just be stalling for time here with fake prototypes while they're actually working on the real thing. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So it's time to dig a little bit further. Now, at long last, we get to the burning question at the center of this matter. Is what they are trying to do even possible? AKA, is it possible to deliver a multi-core FPGA powered system that includes the SNES, Genesis, NES, ColecoVision, Intellivision, Atari 2600, etc., all at $150 price point, or even cheaper if you get the early bird version? And is it possible to do this in a reasonable amount of time? Well, let's look at what people have done in terms of FPGA cores in emulating video consoles thus far to try and make an assessment. So I have a bunch of FPGA core projects listed down below which clone a wide variety of consoles which the Chameleon hopes to be able to clone. Now if we go through these, we can easily see that all of them have been done before. The NES, Genesis, ColecoVision and Atari 2600 all have pretty well publicized and active projects going on, and as such, writing code to clone these systems shouldn't be too hard because there's actually something to start from. The Intellivision is somewhat rarer, but Kevtris, an Atari Age user I mentioned earlier, has managed to clone it in its entirety, so at the very least it can be done by one person with a little bit of effort. But finally, this takes us to where the problem lies, the SNES. What the Coleco Chameleon team is supposed to have had at the toy fair is an already developed working SNES core. At least that's what they were claiming to show. The issue is that the SNES is particularly difficult to clone on an FPGA. In fact, it's only been done twice as far as Google knows without returning results for the Chameleon. The first time someone successfully made a FPGA SNES was actually a long-term hobby project by P-Gate1, a Japanese electrical engineer. In fact, a lot of their development notes are online, which are badly translated down below. From these notes, there are several key facts which show you what you need to do in order to come up with the working SNES core. The first thing to note is how long their project took. It took them 10 years of reverse engineering in order for them to create their current model, which isn't even perfect because it doesn't support Super FX games like Star Fox if the translation of their notes is accurate. Now I should point out that they are just a hobbyist and they are just one person working on the project, but starting from complete scratch, that's the kind of time frame that you're looking at for one person to come up with at least a working SNES core, and even not a complete one at that. And what we're supposed to believe is that the Chameleon team, which is mostly composed out of non-engineers, have apparently finished theirs in a couple of months and it works perfectly. The second thing to note is the kind of hardware that this person used for their SNES core. They found that the SNES contained way too many circuits to fit on a relatively cheap $150 Altera DE1 board, and so he was planning on using 2 of these boards, but ultimately he settled for a $600 DE2 development board instead, which is a hell of a long way from the $150 asking price of the Coleco Chameleon. However, the second time someone tried to clone a SNES and this one didn't even work is rather more interesting. A group of 4 students doing a high-level design paper at Carnegie Mellon University decided to attempt it for a senior engineering project, and their report is actually available online. Oh, and incidentally, this team was using a $900 Vertex 5 FPGA in order to implement the project, about as far away from the $150 asking price as you could possibly get. Now, their project took 3 to 4 months of hard labor. However, there's a rather interesting fact about their project. They didn't start from scratch. You see, the SNES core is actually based on a WDC 65816 processor chip from the Western Design Center, and as such, the Western Design Center still retain the original Verilog code for the chip, which is basically the code that is used to program how the FPGA is supposed to operate. The Western Design Center allowed the students to have the original quote-unquote source code of the chip under a non-disclosure agreement, and so instead of starting from scratch, the students had Verilog code of the CPU to work from, which actually did give them a good head start on their project. Now, I bring this up for a very interesting reason. Would it not be a reasonable assertion that if you're going to be seriously trying to program a SNES clone of an FPGA, let alone one that works perfectly in a couple of months, that you would look at both of these past attempts? Because if that's a reasonable assertion, then wouldn't it be logical to see if the Western Design Center might be a possible partner in your project, seeing as they've given out the Verilog of the chip in question before? So what I decided to do is this. I followed up with the Western Design Center and asked them if they've ever had any contact with any member of the Coleco Chameleon or even the Retro VGS team. One of their staff members, who was very helpful, replied to me very quickly with some interesting information. It seems that the staff at the WDC have been following the project with some interest, and while they would be happy to let someone use their product for something like the Chameleon, they've not had any contact with the Chameleon staff or the VGS staff. Not a call, not an email, nothing. Now, I'm not going to try and put too fine a point on it, but if you're going to try and create a project like this, and I'm just thinking out loud here, wouldn't it make sense that you would contact a company to potentially license the source code from them, or at least figure out how much it would cost instead of just starting your project from scratch and reverse engineering the entire thing? All I'm gonna say is this: isn't it weird that they didn't reach out to the one company who could have handed them their CPU almost completed, saving a bunch of time? Now, again, I'm no engineer, but I think that perhaps we can apply some basic common sense here and reach a reasoned conclusion. From these two projects, the only somewhat successful implementations of a SNES on an FPGA that exist, as far as internet research goes, it seems unlikely to impossible given the amount of time, work, and expensive hardware involved that the Coleco Chameleon team could have developed a SNES core in a few months and took it to the toy fair, let alone one that would cost $150 to retail at the end of the day, even if they were planning to sell the console at a loss. Now, I'll finish up by saying this: the Coleco Chameleon is probably one of the most unique Kickstarter Fugazi attempts I think I've ever seen, and I've seen a hell of a lot of them. This is by far and away the only project that I've seen that is lying before it even gets to the stage of asking people for money. And that's really where the irony lies. If they had proceeded with the campaign without the community busting them, then things might have actually been a lot worse for them, because money would have then been changing hands under false pretenses, aka the pretense that they had an actual working prototype that they originally created. So really, ironically, they should be grateful that the community uncovered the sham when they did, otherwise they might have been in a lot of trouble. I've been Dangerous Analysis, thank you to all of my subscribers, and as always,
good night and good luck.